Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Authors at Google. We've got a great author today. His name is Ken Wells, and he's written this wonderful book, Travels with Barley, which you should all have, right? Everyone have one? Nice. Okay. He's going to autograph those later? Yes. So Ken is a Pulitzer Prize finalist. He spent 24 years as a writer and editor on the Wall Street Journal. In 2005, he was named the Brewers Association Consumer Print Journalist of the Year, for a series of beer pieces he published in the Wall Street Journal. In 2006, he left the paper to take a job as a senior editor for Condé Nast Portfolio, which I just told him I subscribed to recently. It's a wonderful magazine. Seriously, like 2 weeks ago, I subscribed to it. Anyway, he continues to write about this wonderful beverage we'll be talking about today, which is beer. Beer, yes, beer. So please, warm welcome for Ken Wells and Travels with Barley.
Okay, if you read my book, you actually know that there's a saying, who said, beer is proof that God loves us and wants us to be happy? No, it's Hillary Clinton. Last week on Larry King Live, you saw her, after the sniper incident, she and Chelsea went to knock back some Bud Light with the PX guys, and they came to her in a vision. Beer is proof that God loves us and wants us to be happy. I'm giving that to you, Hillary. That's my political comment for the night. I was a enthusiastic but amateur, pretty much totally amateur beer drinker about 4 or 5 years ago when I was dragged into a meeting at the Wall Street Journal. We had a book publishing enterprise, and the idea was to sort of team up journal writers who had story ideas with books, and business books mainly. And I was a novelist on the side. I grew up in the swamps of Louisiana, and I write these little books about these novels about the Louisiana swamp. And the guy who was running the book program called me in for a brainstorming session, and this was mainly for business books. And we were going around the room, and someone, not me, said, "What about a book on the beer industry?" And for some reason, everybody in the room looked at me. I don't know why that was. I actually was one of the 5 or 6 journalists at the Wall Street Journal who drank beer regularly. This seemed to me to be too good to be true, but they're actually we had a partner with Simon & Schuster at that time, and he was in the room and said, "This could be great. This could be great if you could, come up with the right idea." So I rushed back to my PC and I Googled like crazy. Not one Yahoo. I Googled like crazy. And damn, my mama drowned all the dumb ones. It turned out that the beer industry in America turned out to be an $86 billion industry. It was bigger than the mining industry, bigger than the record industry, bigger than the movie industry. And the more I dug into it, the more I thought I came up with a conceit. If you think about that as a metaphorical river running through the heart of American commerce and through the hearts, minds, and passion of 95 million beer drinkers, if you got on the river beer, what would you find? So my idea was to float up or down or upside down in the river of beer. And so I actually wrote a book proposal, and they went for it. I mean, I couldn't believe it. I mean, I really could not believe it. Would you give a baby a bottle of gin? I mean, would you give Dick Cheney a gun? I mean, it's like. I mean, it was astonishing, and see, because the way it worked was that our book program it worked like a sabbatical. So that means if the publishing company, Simon & Schuster, God bless them, accepted my idea, the journal would keep me on staff at full pay and benefits and expenses for a year to write about beer. So I got this project, and it was the biggest beer doggle of my career so far. In fact, it was so hard to believe. But before I left on my road trip, I shorted the stock, and that's why Rupert Murdoch bought it so cheaply. They did an audit, and they found out that all this beer had been bought. It sounds funny, but it was kind of challenging. But because to be blessed with such a great project, suddenly here I had the book I'd always wanted to write, obviously, and a credit card to write it well with. And so I was determined, though. I mean, how embarrassing would it be at the end of what I call beer year, because they were going to give me a year, and it actually turned into a year and a half. So I actually got 18 months to this. How embarrassing would it be at the end of that project if I did not write a book that was really tremendously reported and sort of met Wall Street Journal standards? So it really scared me because, after about the first 4 days on the road, I kept thinking this would be a great book if I can remember any of it. The problem on the river of beer was not access; it was going home. You would be in Clarksdale, Mississippi, at 2:00 in the morning, and you'd already sampled, I don't know, 100 beers, maybe not 100 beers, a lot of beers, and someone would be saying, "Ken, you got to come with us now to this roadhouse, down there where they serve, gallons of Bud Light for $1, and the waitresses don't wear any clothes, and and I can't go. I mean, I can't drink another beer." So it's hard. I actually went into training. I started jogging 5 miles every day, and just so that I would not, look like Norm at Cheers at the end of that year. It was hard. Finally, I got some good advice from a guy in a bar in Dubuque, Iowa. He said, "Ken, take your notes early," but I did better than that. I bought one of those digital tape recorders, and so I would go around in the bar and I would introduce myself and I'd say, "I'm Ken Wells and I'm writing about a book about beer." And it's kind of hard in the bars, often to interview people. But I would just switch it on and then people would just talk. And the most amazing story is that I think it was also in Clarksdale, Mississippi. I woke up the next day kind of late. I woke up the next day and I switched on my recorder, and there was this incredible conversation that I was in with guys in the bar in Clarksdale whose names I don't know, about rattlesnakes, and I have no memory of that conversation. A great deal of the book is about craft beer, but it was kind of unavoidable to write about that big company in St. Louis, Anheuser-Busch, and they sell half the beer in America. Last year, they sold 157 million barrels of beer. That's $18 billion worth of beer. That seems like a lot, but that's what Exxon made last week on the gas that they sold to American consumers. But it's still a lot of money. But the funny thing is, as big as they are, there's this thing called the craft brew movement, and they have repopulated our American beerscape with a lot of really interesting beers. And there's a real jealousy among the big guys who kind of make this, well, let's face it, sort of watered down, middle of the road kind of beer. I mean, I drink Budweiser. If I'm at a place and there's nothing else, I certainly will not turn down a Budweiser. And I think it's for what they do, it's fine. But it was hilarious. I actually, about a year ago, I was reading about them, and they put out an announcement. And this is what's true. So they were going to be the first major brewer to infuse beer with caffeine, guarana, and ginseng. The first to do that. Now, I didn't realize there was a race on, to make that beer, but apparently there was, But so, and they made that beer, and it sort of came and it went. But what really surprised me was the lack of creative response from the craft beer industry. I mean, what were they thinking? They were letting Budweiser make this beer with caffeine, guarana, and ginseng, and they had not responded. I called up my friend Sam at, Dogfish Brewery and said, "I've got an idea for you, Sam. What about a beer made with Viagra and ecstasy?" I mean, you got to respond, Viagra and ecstasy. Now, there's a great Belgian beer called Chimay. Well, see, this beer could be called She Will. Sam hasn't made it yet. I'm disappointed. I keep waiting for it. We were talking earlier. The thing that I noticed about the river beer was how friendly it is. I mean, people, the beer community, especially the beer press. I mean, I came as an outsider. I was just an average beer drinker, and then I was writing this book. And if you're a beer geek, or if you know anything about the beer press, there's a guy named Michael Jackson who was he was the greatest beer writer in the history of the world, and MJ we would call him. And I came to know him, and he was a stunningly good journalist and writer. I mean, I spent 24 years on the Wall Street Journal, and I'm convinced Michael Jackson could have written about anything. And he was a very good writer. And anyway, I'm doing this book, and so I approach him, and there's the blurb game, where you got to get people who know something about the subject to say something nice about your book. So I kind of sheepishly handed Michael my manuscript and said, you don't actually have to read it; you just have to just say something nice about me. But he was so nice, he did. He gave me this great blurb, and I went home, and over the kitchen table that night, I'm telling my family that, Michael Jackson has just given me a blurb, and my teenage daughter says, "Michael Jackson? Dad just gave you a blurb?" And of course, she thought it was Michael the pop star, and she said, "Dad, is that a good idea? That thing with the boys that he does?" And it's true. I mean, and then I had this thought of, MJ knocking back a bunch of Bud Ices with, some 11-year-old boys, playing Beat It, in Neverland. It would be a bad association for my book. So, the thing about beer joints, it's great. The whole river of beer is about storytelling. The great thing, people get a couple beers in them, they want to tell you a story. Everybody's got a story. It's all about digression. So I'm just going to digress, because that's what you do, in beer. And I'm headed towards St. Louis during my beer trip. I ended up. The conceit of the book is I spent about 3 weeks driving the entire length of the Mississippi River in a quest to find the perfect beer joint. And I'm somewhere outside of St. Louis, heading to the Anheuser-Busch plant, and stop to fill my car with Exxon unleaded or something like that, And I put my credit card in, and on the screen, on the gas pump, there's a Shania Twain video coming up, and I'm going, when did this happen? When did every moment in America, have to sort of be a media moment? I had no idea that, they were putting Shania Twain on the gas pump. It just seemed like a, extraneous thing to me, and I thought, well, this is so odd, And then the next week in the New York Times, there's a story about this system, basically above urinals, where it's a motion sensor, and you would walk up to a urinal, and it would activate a blast of urinal music. You walk it up, and it would start playing music. I mean, that's so. I didn't want to know more than that. I mean, do you want to know what urinal music is? I mean, what if you were already listening to it? I mean, wouldn't that be like really embarrassing? It's like, God, I'm listening to urinal music. But I thought, well, out of this could come an opportunity for the beer companies, especially those companies that make really strong beer. So actually, I wrote an ad, for a beer company, And then here's the setup. Guy walks up to the urinal, and the urinal starts talking to him. "Hey, buddy, back so soon? That light beer really gets to you, don't it? I'll tell you what, if you were drinking Dogfish Head Worldwide Stout at 23% alcohol by volume, you wouldn't have to come here so often. In fact, if you drank 2 of them, you wouldn't be able to come here at all. Dogfish Head, save yourself a trip." I think it's got I was always pestered on the river of beer about whether I brewed beer, but I had not brewed beer. And home brewers are like the Mormon Church. They're missionary. They want to convert you to brewing, and why don't you? And you have to brew. And you have to brew. And I heard this so much that finally, one Christmas, my daughter. I have 2 daughters, and my daughter surprised me with a Christmas gift. It was a brewing kit, and it appeared on the Christmas tree, and I unwrapped it, and it seemed kind of flimsy, but and I said, "Well, where'd you get it?" And they said, "Bed Bath and Beyond." Wow! So I had myself a brewing kit from Bed Bath and Beyond, but of course my daughters had given it to me, and I can't let my daughters down, so I have to brew the beer. So I get out the instructions, and I didn't realize how messy it was. That's why I now buy beer. It's so much easier to just buy beer instead of cooking it in your kitchen for hours and hours. But I dutifully, followed the recipe, and then, and then I did the boil, and I put in 3 times the hops that I want, because I really like hops, and then I put it in the container, and I let it sit for the 30 days and then the 60 days, and nothing seemed to be happening, And finally, I about 2.5 months later, I said, well, it's probably as good as it's ever going to get. So I poured it into the little bottles. This is all plastic bottles, plastic. Should never get a plastic brewing kit from Bed Bath and Beyond. and I tasted it, and it, I realized that it wasn't good or it wasn't bad. So I ran out to the store and I got this beer and I brought it in and I tasted it side by side. And I realized I had made Michelob Ultra. I mean, Anheuser-Busch spent like $40 million developing Michelob Ultra. It's going to come to me. I mean, I wanted to read, again, the conceit of this book is a journey down the Mississippi River in the quest for the perfect beer joint. And I know you'll ask me what the perfect beer joint is, but my riposte is still that, a man on an expense account should not be in too much of a hurry to discover, the end of his quest. And so certainly as long as I had the Wall Street Journal's credit card, I was not willing to declare anything. But I went to a lot of good beer joints. But to some extent, the fun of the book was to sort of look at America through the prism of a beer glass, And I've chosen Mississippi because I believe in, longitude to me is more interesting than latitude. I don't know why that is. It's maybe a curious thing, but if you come down the river, you're starting up in the plains, basically, where you have good Germans and Swedes who settle up there near the Canadian border, and you come down to the Midwest, which is the beer belly of America. By repute, Midwesterners drink more beer than per capita than anybody else in the United States. And then you head on down, and I knew that I would end up in two of my favorite cities, Memphis and New Orleans, and I knew that New Orleans, while it perhaps lacked a great beer culture, was full of drunks, and there would certainly be a lot of beer there. But I wanted to, given what's happened to and I grew up in Louisiana, about 50 miles from New Orleans, down in the swamps, and New Orleans has remained, my favorite city in the world, of course, of the events after Katrina. But I'd like to just sort of read this passage about getting into New Orleans, which is sort of my hymn to my favorite city as I was on the River of Beer. As I crossed the Mississippi River Bridge, New Orleans lay sprawled and steaming in the flat, hot light of a late Louisiana afternoon. The river below was the color of dark mustard and moved as though it were a lethargic snake prodded reluctantly into motion. A tug pushing a string of barges upriver carved a white, frothy river through the current, and in the distance a cargo ship did a slow, awkward pirouette, attempting to tow point downstream toward the Gulf of Mexico, just a few more bends in the river away. The air smelled heavy with rain. In most places, summer reliably loosens its grip in September, but in New Orleans, which after all sits in the swamp, summer cloaks the city like damp mosquito netting until sometime in October, often late October, when a cool front finally has the guts to come and rip the stultifying veil away. Yet, its rain-drenched, mosquito-plagued equatorial summers aside, I love New Orleans. I grew up 60 miles to the southwest in a little place called Bayou Black, near the Cajunized town of Houma, which once proclaimed itself the oyster capital of the world. And for years, New Orleans seemed as close as I might ever come to places like New York or San Francisco. It was my big city. It was where, when I turned 18, then the legal drinking age, I came with friends to Bourbon Street to gape at what seemed so forbidden and sophisticated, to sit in darkened, smoke-filled clubs where bartenders in bow ties, with an unerring eye for rustics like us, emptied our wallets collecting for mandatory, overpriced Singapore slings, while women who seemed like apparitions of desire danced in ways that our Catholic mothers never warned us about. We would then, though usually broke, slip into some jazz club, hoping the crowds would shield us from the dread two-drink minimum, and we would listen to music that we knew was superior to all other music and that we listened ourselves to in a superior way, for we knew jazz belonged to Louisiana and to New Orleans and thus to us. And though we were from the country, we were at least natives. Well, at least we were not from Iowa. I have now seen New York and San Francisco, Sydney and Cape Town, London and Paris, and yet New Orleans endures as my favorite city. Hardly the most handsome, definitely not the most cultured, incurably not the most progressive. Still, I love the wet mystery of it, the feral seediness of it, the laconically joyful way it continues to shrug and most of the conventions that the homogenized ramparts of America live by. New Orleans always seems more Latin and European than American to me. It is like a dissolute but beloved old uncle, sometimes drunk, often outrageous, at turns maddeningly irresponsible, but always hilariously interesting and passionately moved by the verities: food, music, love, sex, and booze. God is everywhere here, in the city's monuments to old world Catholicism, like St. Louis Cathedral, in its moldering cemeteries, and in its lawn shrines to the Virgin Mary, and sin is everywhere too. But as to the subject at hand, beer, New Orleans, I have to admit, is at best only an average beer town. Since the days of that gifted rum runner Jean Lafitte, New Orleans has always been more bourbon than beer, but that doesn't mean that if you count wretched excess, that it still doesn't have its own brand of beer culture. New York is a city that never sleeps, and the world has a surplus of cities on the move, cities that work, cities that see the clear arc of the future and pose themselves accordingly. Thank God New Orleans will never be one of those. New Orleans is a city that never stops drinking, and I might add, eating. That's my hometown. So I would like now, if to open it to questions. I mean, you can ask me anything that you want to about my experiences on the river of beer. We can talk about beer styles or beer tasting or anything that you'd like to talk about. So.
I'd like to know your top 5 favorite bars in America.
Okay. Well, on the river of beer, I guess the favorite of the bars that I attended ended up being this place called the Casino in La Crosse, Wisconsin, which is really hole in the wall. It was run by an 80-year-old retired Marine who, when he heard, he ran the bar from his apartment upstairs and almost never came downstairs. And when he heard that there was a writer from the Wall Street Journal writing a beer book, he still refused to come downstairs and talk to him. He had no interest. And he had these really cranky signs. One that there was a big Bud label with a big cross through it, like no Bud allowed. And then he had this whole essay on the inferiority of Canadian beers, which I actually agree with him. I hope there are no Canadians here that I'm offending, but and then there was a great jukebox and there was lesbian dancing, So I mean, to me that's a potent combination. And they had, I should mention the beer too. They had something like 300 styles or 300 different beers in the cooler case. So it was a quirky place, and the thing about, I like brew pubs. Brew pubs are great, but actually, I like my beer joints a little on the sleazy side. There's got to be some sort of element of grease or sleaze, or there has to be, like, the jukebox has to have "Crazy" by Patsy Cline, New York, Tumbling Weeds, Sex Machine, at least those 4, or just, to me, it's just not really it can't even come close to qualifying as my favorite beer joint. As I headed down the river of beer, a couple of bars in Clarksdale, Mississippi were, hilarious. If you want my serious recommendation about, what, like the great beer bars, here in New York City, the Blind Tiger. And by the way, there's a party Tuesday night for this book at the Blind Tiger. Free beer, from 5 till the taps run dry. And Dogfish Head is donating the beer, so come. You're all welcome to come. And that is one of the great, the Tiger to me still ranks as one of the great beer bars in the country. They really are hilariously experimental, and they're constantly changing their menu. If you want to go drink serious craft beer, though, you have to go to Portland. Portland is still, that is the city. There's something like 27 breweries, or brew pubs in the city limits of Portland. I think I say in the book that, it actually, by beer styles made and number of bars to per capita population, it probably now holds the mantle as sort of being the beer drinkingest place on earth, and it's all great craft beer. And the other anomaly is that, whereas in America, only 6% of all the beer sold is craft beer, in Portland, something like 70% of all the beer that's sold is craft beer. So they are kind of a vision of what craft beer could become in America if people get smarter. It really, the whole issue is education. If the number of writers at newspapers and magazines who have been writing about wine for 50 years now have been writing about beer the entire time, I actually think that the relationship between craft beer and what we call industrial beer would be almost like 50-50 now. But it's been a very slow process. But when you see what they're doing, at the moment they are at the growth end of the market. Like craft brew sales grew 16% last year, whereas the industrial beer market was sort of totally flat. So it's I think when people say there's a good chance that there can be this incredible spurt in craft beer over the next 10 years, I think that's absolutely true. And especially as, I mean, let's face it, it's like, where I came from in Louisiana growing up, I mean, there were no beer choices. By that time, most of the big lager makers had gone out of business. And there was a regional maker called Dixie, which got knocked out by Hurricane Katrina. But, it was Budweiser and Bud Light and, all these. And even now when you go down there. But in places like New York City and in a place like this, I mean, people are totally on to the fact that this is the most interesting time in the history of the planet to drink beer. There's never been a better time. There's never been more beer choice right now. In America, I mean, whatever you want to say about, the European beer snobs, and look, the Belgians and those monks make fabulous beer, and the Germans know how to make their lagers, and the Czechs know how to make their lagers. But if you really want to know where the hub of beer, exploration and experimentation is, it's right here in America, and it's mostly scattered in the West and in, New York State. But more and more places are, going for making this kind of beer. And that's what's so great. I mean, I was just back in Louisiana on an assignment, and there's a brand new craft brewery in New Orleans. I mean, it's now the third one there, and there was a place 5 years ago that didn't have one. So I think the word and the message is getting out, and that people are beginning to discover that, it's not your father's beer, And again, I'm not, I went when I was in graduate school and I had no money. I used to buy Buckhorn. Buckhorn was made by one of those. It was Olympia, I believe, which went out of business. One of those lagers that went out of business, and it was 99 cents a six pack, and that's why I bought it. I thought it was pretty good for 99 cents a six pack, So anybody who drank 99-cent pack, Buckhorn can't get too ahead of himself. That's always been my motto.
So first off, Chicago and the whole central region is very excited that you picked a Wisconsin bar. There they are.
Oh, I'm sorry.
They loved it.
Sorry.
No. They just sent me a message that they're stoked that Wisconsin was on the list. So I've read the book, and there are an incredible cast of characters that you meet along the way. Was there anyone that was so outlandish that you couldn't write about them? Anyone that got left out of the book that you wish you could have included, but was
there are warrants out for me in a few states, so I can't say too much. I mean, in the main, I saw a lot of drunks misbehaving in bar rooms, but in the main, the River of Beer was not a dysfunctional place. I mean, most people, I think Thoreau said that, the tavern will compare favorably with the church. And what I really got out of my, drift through America was that, mostly people go to beer joints, for community and camaraderie. They're not there to get blindingly drunk. And of course, today it's harder to do that because of drunk driving laws. I mean, the other astonishing sea change in American drinking habits is that 15 years ago, 75% of all beer was consumed in bars, and 25% at home, and now it's exactly the opposite, and that's totally because of of drunk driving laws, and which is a good thing. I mean, but it's an incredible sea change in the way that beer is served, and that means that there are a lot of lonely people though drinking Miller Lite at home. That's the disconcerting thought. The other funny thing that my friend Michael Jackson, the beer writer, not that Michael Jackson, he had this brilliant observation, because I've been to Texas. I went to Houston for the chapter on Homebrewing, where I hung out with the Foam Rangers for a weekend during a contest. But we went to some beer bars, but then we just went after it gets late at night. Let's just go to where they got a mechanical bull and see if we can ride it. So this time we're all drunk, and we're on the bus. We're not driving, Mama. So we're and it was hilarious. You go to this bar, and his observation is right. In America, the more macho the bar, usually the wimpier the beer. That is, all these places that have all these cowboys in their 10-gallon hats that are riding mechanical bulls, and they got their pickup trucks out back and then gun racks, and and they're all drinking Miller Lite. I mean, what's that about? There's something wrong. Come on, boys. It's weird. I just thought the whole thing was kind of weird, don't you think? Michael Jackson, is that what I was talking about? I forgot what I was talking about. Michael Jackson. Anyway, but that was his observation that, again. But the other thing that got to me, and it was hard convincing the beer geeks, but I ran into a lot of people, in little places, who actually like Budweiser. In other words, there's, we can mock sort of that mass market taste, but there are a lot of people who had experimented with a whole lot of beer, including imports and and occasionally craft beer, but they actually liked their Budweiser, and they would speak fondly of it, and they would talk about the little green apple. If you really, when you open it, there's that little green apple acetaldehyde flavor that comes off of Bud. I mean, I never noticed it. I thought it was kind of skunky myself, But and so I'm in Mississippi at this bar, and there's this giant man. He's a giant, the biggest man I saw in the whole river beer. He's like the guy who could take up two of those. He'd take up two seats. And he was sitting there in the bar, and he kind of had this big head, and his eyes were wide open, and he had Budweiser in each hand. He was a two-fisted drinker, and he'd drink one this way, and then he'd drink this way. And so I went up to interview him because I would ask everybody a question about the perfect beer joint, and his answer was hot women. That guy's an optimist, man. He is a double seater, and he's, but anyway, and I said, well, I noticed that you're drinking Bud, and he said, I used to drink Miller, and I tried Heineken, but I didn't like it very much, and there was something else you tried, but he said, but you know what Bud stands for? And I said, King of Beers, and he said, no, because you deserve what every individual. Well, he had made up an entire acronym to praise Budweiser, praise Budweiser, praise Budweiser. So, the beer geeks scoff, but, there are a lot of people who like their Bud, and they like their Miller, and they claim that they can sort of tell the difference. And that seems like that would sort of be an apocryphal story, but, there's, the thing about Budweiser, Anheuser-Busch is that in 1955, they were the fourth largest beer company in America. Schlitz was the number one, Falstaff was ahead of them, and Pabst was ahead of them. So any one of those could have emerged out of that whole scrum, and become the king of beers. But, the Bushes, whatever you want to say about them, were hard-headed business people who actually sort of got the whole notion of national marketing and using. I think I was saying earlier in private that, Anheuser-Busch's advertising budget is around $400 to $500 million a year. And the biggest craft brewer in America, their total revenues, that's, Samuel Adams, is $200 million a year. So the marketing arm of Budweiser spends twice what the best craft beer maker in America makes in a year. So the disparity between that and real beer is amazing. But Budweiser, they can make any beer they want. I've actually been invited into private tastings with their brewmaster, and they will go into the kitchen and they will bring out they were giving me this blueberry fruit beer. It was fabulous. Really. If you are a $200 million company, $200 billion company, you can afford to hire good brewers. There's just no doubt about it. But and they make this beer, but the problem is that it doesn't appear anywhere. They'll make 500 cases and they'll sell it around St. Louis, and then they'll say they can put on their website, here's our our great honey wheat beer, here's our Michelob fruit beer. And it's very good stuff, but they realize that the great margins, you're not going to make $18 billion on that kind of beer.
And I did a study abroad in Europe, and I noticed that they didn't use preservatives in beers. And I tend to notice that the taste of the beer was a lot better, and that even though it was perishable, it was still, you never had a hangover. I don't know if what your thoughts are on.
No, but look, I think you're absolutely right. I can't drink Miller. I just can't drink it because it gives me a headache. There's this, and I'm totally convinced it absolutely has to do with preservatives. And most of the craft, beer makers don't do that. I think almost all of them don't do that, and they use only natural ingredients. Some of them have even gone organic. But I think that makes it. The revolution. The point is that in America, certainly before Prohibition, we were still mostly a lager nation, but all those big brewing companies still brewed with hops and real barley, and yeast, and they all had their proprietary yeast. And it was really Prohibition, the Depression, Prohibition, and then World War II, where the big beer companies figured out that they could make these lighter beers by switching away from barley and using corn or rice. And the other part of that is just a lot cheaper. In other words, in terms of fermentable sugars, you get more bang for your buck by using corn than you do barley. But you can tell the difference. But one of the issues with the craft movement in America is that we sort of came through this whole period in which basically we had a generation, almost 2 generations of beer drinkers who had forgotten what pre-Prohibition lager tasted like because they just didn't have it anymore. They were, unless you went to Europe and were drinking Czech, German lagers or drinking imports, a few imports, you'd forgotten how robust American beer could be. I mean, when you have Jim Cook's, Samuel Adams Boston Lager, I mean that's just a really good Prohibition lager, and you can bet that if you were drinking beer in 1927 or so, whenever that, those beers were undoubtedly really robust. I mean, Anheuser-Busch, and look again, it's a really well-run company. It's a profitable company. The fact that they can make Budweiser, I think it's now in 12 breweries, including one in China, that taste so identical that only like 1 or 2 palates in the entire world and a spectrometer can tell the difference is an astonishing feat. I mean, you're technical people. I mean, and every little brewer and every microbrewer will say that the hobgoblin of brewing is consistency. So to be able to do that is an astonishing feat. That is, they are bringing really high style manufacturing processes, to this thing. But to what end? They operate an agricultural arm that acquires all the barley and malt and hops and rice and corn for their beer. And if they were a food company, they'd be like the 3rd largest food company in America. Anheuser-Busch Budweiser consumes 30% of the American rice crop. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, it's really astonishing. And of course, they use rice. And there's a devilish craft brewer named Fred Eckhart, who's kind of famous out on the West Coast, and he actually had done sort of early studies about Budweiser and the way they changed their formula. And he got the Germans to run these mass spec tests on Bud pre-1982, and then after 1982, and he found out that they had actually lowered their hops presence by about 40% in about 2 years. And now, I mean, I actually included, I think, Michelob in one of the beers. I think they brought Ultra, which is not really what I wanted, but I included Michelob because Michelob is the only mass-produced beer in America where you can actually taste the hops. I mean, hops, they used hops because then if they don't use hops, it's not beer. They can't call it beer, so they have to use hops. And they have to use a little barley because if you don't use barley, you really can't call it beer. But they cut the barley with corn and rice. I mean, have you had Natural Light? Natural Light is Budweiser's, Anheuser-Busch's corn lager. I mean, it's the most hilarious thing. It's like fizzy soda pop, and it's made with corn, and and if you knock back enough of them, I guess you could commit mass murder or something. I don't know what you would do. I mean, it's like, I don't. What were they thinking? It's like, it's not really beer. I mean, it's just kind of odd. It's made almost. I think it's totally made with corn. It's a corn lager. It's like so. Oh, if you want, like the Beast, Milwaukee's Best.
What's the worst? That's the best. That's the question.
Well, that's one of the worst. That one and Natty Light are really down there at the bottom. I mean, you have to go to like some of those like Billy Beer, some of these these one-off beers that were sort of made like these. Right, but when you like get to Busch Light and those kinds of things, it's like you're really veering away from the beer category and getting into something that's totally completely different. But it's cheap and people drink it, and I was in a bar in Arkansas where all they sold was Natty Light, and the guy says, "Well, my customers who go through half a case a night, that's what they drink because it's a quarter a can." So I mean, if you're looking for pop,
Is there a favorite beer you have with pizza?
Yeah. My favorite, just session beer, just the beer that I have in my refrigerator consistently is Pilsner Urquell. I mean, you cannot find, in my opinion, a better lager on earth. I mean, just it's got all the great ingredients. It's robust. It's incredibly smooth. I mean, it's such a well-made and balanced beer. It's hoppy but not too hoppy, and to me that's like that's a great beer.
What's the craziest hangover remedy you've tried, and also what's the most effective?
Most effective.
Craziest and effective for both.
Well, I mean, the one that works is like you come home and you drink a bucket of water, like an entire bucket. You have to basically a 2.5 gallon bucket. You just drink the whole thing, and then you go to bed and you wake up. If you survive drowning, you'll be okay in the morning. I've tried the tomato juice and all that stuff. But nothing. Avoiding a hangover is usually the best way, and that's either by drinking not too much, and if that's unavoidable, by drinking the best there is. Because again, that I really believe whoever's talking about the preservatives, if you drink cheap stuff, it'll get you. It really will get you.
So I saw that in your book you mentioned that beer might actually have health benefits.
Oh yeah.
So can you talk about that? Because that way it won't feel so bad drinking so much.
No, sure. Beer is high in vitamin B, first of all, and it's very rich in antioxidants. And one of the things there's a whole chapter in the book on the beer cure. I call it the beer cure. But it turns out that there were these scientists, a guy from Harvard and a guy from Texas A&M, I believe, who had done these studies, which basically said that beer drunk in moderation, and moderation is always the key word. And moderation for most adult males, like a couple of beers a day, and for a woman, it's a beer and a half a day. I guess it's body size. Remember that, But that beer actually gives you absolutely the same benefits as red wine. That the sort of whole red wine thing was kind of overstated, and that the wine snobs are kind of pulling a fast one on it. But and the truth is, the smart scientists basically say it's really sort of the ethanol, the alcohol in beer, which is also an antioxidant, that probably gives you the best pop. So yeah, I'm so convinced that if given a choice, you might as well die a drinker, as a non-drinker, because I think the health benefits are unassailable. And what Frank Sinatra said, the thing about people that don't drink, they wake up and this is the best they're going to feel all day. It's like what a horrible thing that is. And Hemingway said, "I have to be drunk sometimes to be with my fools," and I totally understand that. So don't feel drink moderately and be happy.
So I feel like every couple months I've discovered that one of my preferred beers is being taken over by or is run by one of the big industrial firms. And I'm curious where you think this is all going to be in 5 years, if it's kind of going to have the Starbucks effect where everybody's owned by one of the big companies, and if that's a bad thing.
I don't think so. I mean, I think what's going to happen. I mean, I think first of all industrial beer, the big three, which is Anheuser-Busch, SAB Miller, and Coors Molson. They recognize that they are kind of stalled out at their growth levels, and that the growth is in craft beer. So they're going to be doing two things. They're going to be launching more labels, and they're going to be trying to buy, smaller breweries. But a lot of these little guys are not going to sell out. And I have to say that in the cases where they have sold out, like in I think Widmer, I believe, and Red Hook, both sold percentages to Anheuser-Busch. I mean, they're shrewd enough not to fool with the brewery. They bought the labels so that they could have a stake in the craft brew business, which is the growth side of the business. And so I think there will be more of that, but I don't really look at sort of a takeover by big beer of little beer. I think that and I think that given the sort of the inquisitive nature of the craft brew movement at the moment, that you're just going to see more and more interesting beer being made and more experimentation and so I mean I love it because everywhere I go now I always try to find a great craft beer bar or craft beer store, and look at these regional beers, and there's just astonishingly tasty stuff to drink all over America right now. So.
I think we have run down on time. Big thank you to Ken. We
Thank you
really
very much.
appreciate you coming out.